we're going to take a really compassionate but clinical look at a heavy topic, the historical engineering of psychological trauma and how it's still echoing today. If you are dedicated to doing the inner work, this right here is an absolutely essential map. Because we aren't just looking backward at history, we're mapping out the precise path to collective healing by understanding exactly how the mind was targeted in the first place. So we have to open our diagnostic journey with a pretty profound question, one that sits right at the heavy center of community healing. Are the struggles we see, like the cycles of distrust, the fractures within our own communities, are those inherent flaws? Or are they the completely predictable, engineered symptoms of deliberate psychological conditioning? Because let's be real, to heal a wound, we have to know exactly how it was inflicted. Okay, part 1, the architecture of breaking. To really understand the symptom, we first have to examine the root cause. We're going to unearth the historical blueprint of this psychological warfare to see exactly how the breaking occurred. Now, the artifact we're looking at first is the Let's Make a Slave document, which a lot of you know as the Willie Lynch letter. And look, whether historians debate it as an authentic artifact from 1712 or an apocryphal text written later to summarize the era, its precise, chillingly accurate description of how human beings were systematically broken remains an incredibly vital diagnostic tool for us today. It lays out the exact methodology of psychological control. This text outlines a clinical, hyper-calculated methodology. It details how enslavers were instructed to deliberately magnify any differences they could find, literally pitting the old against the young, the light-skinned against the dark-skinned, the male against the female. By weaponizing these differences, the goal was to completely sever community bonds. Because think about it, you absolutely cannot build resistance if you're too busy fighting each other. And the core engine of that division is clearly defined right there in the text. It explicitly states, I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. The method involved intentionally destroying the protective male image, usually through horrific public violence, and traumatizing the female into this frozen state of fear and absolute dependency. This architecture created a terrifyingly efficient cycle that was designed to basically self-generate for centuries, just passing from parent to child. Moving right along to part 2, captivity and Stockholm Syndrome. So shifting from that historical artifact over to modern clinical literature, we can start to diagnose how this centuries-long, trauma-bonded captivity perfectly mirrors well-documented psychological survival mechanisms. Let's look at Stockholm Syndrome. According to the EBSCO clinical research, this is a psychological phenomenon where hostages or victims actually develop sympathetic feelings toward their captors. And what's wild is that clinical studies show this psychological pivot can happen in literally a matter of days. When a dominant entity holds the absolute power of life and death, victims often adopt the beliefs of their abusers. Now listen, this is not out of weakness. It is a deeply ingrained, highly complex psychological survival strategy. Experts have actually identified 4 specific characteristics common to people enmeshed in these trauma-bonded scenarios. Captives develop positive feelings for the abuser, they have no prior relationship, they deeply distrust outside authorities, and the captors eventually view the captives as human, though strictly within the confines of their control. Mapping these exact steps onto the historical enslaved experience, it reveals how perfectly this syndrome functions as a protective shield in an inescapable, profoundly hostile world. Which brings us to part 3, diagnosing intra-community violence. With this clinical lens firmly in place, we can now use the brilliant diagnostic work of psychologist Dr. Amos Wilson to examine intra-community violence. Dr. Wilson argues that we have to completely depathologize our communities by contrasting the oppressor's myth against clinical reality. You see the myth on the left that falsely labels criminality in the Black community as something inherent or natural. But the clinical reality on the right shows that this violence is an engineered, totally predictable downstream effect of the unhealed psychological conditioning we were just talking about. Building on this, Dr. Wilson points out a fascinating mechanism of the human mind called projection. He argues that the dominant white American ego absolutely refuses to accept the reality of its own historical brutality, the exploitation, the violence, the enslavement. So, to protect its own self-image of morality, it projects its own guilt and inherent criminality onto the Black male. It creates a scapegoat so it simply doesn't have to look in the mirror. And this brings us to what Dr. Wilson calls the alienated personality. Just picture the environment for a second. An individual is deprived of legitimate structural avenues for economic success, yet they're constantly bombarded by the consumerist, manufactured desires of the dominant culture. They're suffering from that internalized self-hatred planted by the Willie Lynch-style conditioning. feeling completely powerless to confront the actual systemic oppressor. This alienated individual tragically turns to violence against their own community. It becomes their only perceived mechanism for conflict resolution and gaining any semblance of power. Okay, part 4, reframing Black rage. Now that we've diagnosed the root of intercommunity violence, we turn to the 400-year Holocaust to fundamentally reframe the whole concept of Black rage. The crucial point here is just beautifully captured in this powerful quote by James Baldwin. He reminds us that our profound anger isn't some sort of sickness. It's actually the completely natural, healthy, and rational response of a people whose very humanity has been perpetually denied and debated. The historical reality is that the legal system itself was weaponized. From the casual killing acts of the 17th century, which literally made it perfectly legal to murder an enslaved person without consequence, all the way up through modern discriminatory policies. The system was explicitly built to favor whiteness and to socially, legally, and culturally criminalize Black and brown existence. Criminality was a concept that was conjured up and assigned to us. It was never inherited. I really want you to pause and Socratically reflect on this question for a moment. What does it actually do to the human mind to know for generations that the dominant group can commit violence against you without any legal or social consequence? When you deeply process that reality, isn't profound rage the absolute most rational, legitimate inheritance and response to that environment? Honestly, it's a sign that your mind recognizes injustice. Finally, part 5, reclaiming the mind. Listen, if the symptoms of division and violence were meticulously engineered, then the treatment has to be intentional unlearning. Dr. Wilson notes something incredibly hopeful right here. Our survival, he says, depends on being psychosocially born again. We have to understand our true pre-enslavement history. Why? Because the human mind is remarkably resilient. It has a powerful, almost gravitational drive to correct itself and heal when it's finally given a substantial, truthful, historical base to stand on. Stripping away centuries of illusions created by that architecture of breaking requires focused inner work. We have to actively reject the projected mythology of criminality. We have to connect back to our original historical truth. We must consciously refuse to be divided by those old, rusty weapons of envy, skin shade, or gender. We have to build a psychology rooted in our own reality and collectively rebuild the trust that was so violently stolen from us. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a vital thought to carry forward into your own inner work. The architecture of breaking was deliberate, for sure, but your architecture of healing can be deliberate too. So what specific steps are you going to take today to unlearn the conditioning, reject the illusions, and completely reclaim your magnificent mind? Keep questioning, keep doing the work, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hey there, glad you stopped by. If you're feeling the vibe, stick around for a little while. Don't forget to like and subscribe, like and subscribe.